The handcuffs clicked shut around Tony Castellanos' wrists as the VA investigator read him his rights. Fraud, theft, assault on a veteran. But this story doesn't start with justice. It starts 3 hours earlier with betrayal. Pathetic! You're making us look like amateurs! Maria Rodriguez's bandaged hand trembled as Tony stepped closer. Combat medics don't belong in real hospitals, and damaged goods don't belong in my kitchen. The shouting hit her like shrapnel. Kandahar. Mortars falling, steady hands that never shook, until now. Tony snatched her nursing school acceptance letter and tore it in half. Dreams are for people who earn them. In the corner booth, Frank Sullivan watched through steel-gray eyes. He noticed what others missed. Her military precision, the 82nd Airborne tattoo beneath the bandages. What this decorated veteran didn't know was that her guardian angel wore the same uniform. Sometimes the most powerful battles aren't fought overseas. They're fought in diners where heroes hide in plain sight. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, hit subscribe now. Here's a question. Have you ever wondered about the courage of the person serving your coffee? Let's find out what happened when one veteran's nightmare became another's mission. Some wounds run deeper than others. The Mountain View Diner sat on the outskirts of Colorado Springs, where Purple Heart license plates outnumbered civilian ones in the parking lot. Maria had chosen this job for its proximity to the VA hospital and nursing school, the same school that had finally accepted her GI Bill application, the letter Tony had just destroyed. She needed flexible hours to care for Sophia, her 8-year-old daughter. The accident that crushed her hand happened 2 months ago. Tony had accidentally slammed the freezer door as she reached for supplies, the crack of bone echoing like a gunshot. Frank watched Maria straighten her shoulders with soldier's posture he'd seen in countless soldiers. The same bearing his son David had carried, until an IED outside Kabul brought him home in a flag-draped coffin. This woman, this soldier, deserved better than Tony Castellanos' cruelty. Some battles require different strategies. Frank Sullivan had learned this lesson in 3 different wars, where survival often depended on patience, observation, and knowing when to strike. As he watched Maria endure another day of systematic harassment, he began to understand that this was a different kind of battlefield. But the rules of engagement remained the same. Protect your own. Leave no soldier behind. The next morning brought the usual rush of customers seeking coffee and comfort before facing their day. Maria moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her injured hand tucked close to her body like a wounded wing. She'd developed a system, carrying trays against her hip, using her shoulder to push through doors, smiling through the constant ache that radiated from her wrist to her elbow. Frank occupied his usual corner booth, black coffee and wheat toast, 20% tip left in exact change. To the other customers, he was just another retiree with nowhere better to be. They didn't see the way his eyes cataloged every interaction, every moment of Tony's calculated cruelty. "Rodriguez!" Tony's voice cut across the dining room like a drill sergeant's bark. "Table 6 is still waiting for their order. What's taking so long?" Maria hurried toward the kitchen, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She'd taken the order 5 minutes ago, but the kitchen was backed up because Tony had sent the prep cook home early to save on labor costs. Frank noticed the pattern. Tony created impossible situations, then blamed Maria when things went wrong. It was a systematic campaign designed to justify whatever endgame he had planned. That afternoon, Frank made his first move. While Tony was in the office counting the till, Frank approached the other waitress, Jenny, a college student who'd worked at the diner for 2 years. "That girl's got more backbone than most folks I've served with," Frank said quietly, nodding toward Maria as she cleaned tables with one-handed determination. Jenny glanced around nervously. "Maria? Yeah, she's amazing. Used to be Army, you know. Saved lives and everything. But Tony," she shook her head. "He's got it out for her something fierce." "Why's that?" Jenny's voice dropped to a whisper. "She heard something she wasn't supposed to hear. About the books, you know? Tony's been skimming from the veteran hiring tax credits, claiming employees who don't exist. Maria caught him bragging about it to his buddy after closing one night." Frank's jaw tightened. Stealing from programs designed to help veterans find work was more than theft. It was a betrayal of everything he'd fought for. "That's when the accidents started," Jenny continued. "First her car got keyed. Then someone put salt in the sugar dispensers on her tables, made her look incompetent. And then..." She gestured toward Maria's bandaged hand. Frank felt the familiar burn of combat anger, the cold fury that had carried him through 3 decades of military service. But this was civilian ground, and civilian rules applied. He would need evidence, documentation, witnesses. He would need to be patient. That evening, Frank stayed until closing, nursing his coffee while the diner emptied around him. Through the thin office door, he could hear Tony's voice, loud with alcohol and arrogance. "Another $5,000 this quarter, easy money. And when the audit comes, that little waitress takes the fall. She's already got the most write-ups." Frank's hands clenched around his coffee cup. In the kitchen, Maria was cleaning with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. She didn't know she was being set up to take the blame for Tony's crimes. The next day, Frank began his own investigation. As building owner, he had access to financial records and security footage. He contacted his old friend at the VA, a man who specialized in benefit fraud cases. He documented Tony's schedule, his habits, his associates. He learned that Tony was the nephew of the franchise owner, a man who lived 3 states away and rarely visited. Most importantly, he began building a case that would protect Maria and ensure that justice was served with military precision. As he watched Maria struggle through another shift, her injured hand trembling with fatigue, Frank made a silent promise. The same promise he'd made to every soldier under his command. No one gets left behind. The final battle was about to begin. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when the autumn air carried the promise of winter and the diner buzzed with its usual pre-work crowd. Maria had arrived early, hoping to prep her section before Tony's arrival, but found him already waiting in the kitchen with a stack of papers and a predatory smile. "Staff meeting," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone she'd learned to fear. "Everyone in the back office, now." Jenny shot Maria a worried glance as they filed into the cramped space behind the kitchen. The morning cook, an elderly man named Pete who'd worked at the diner for 15 years, shook his head with disgust but said nothing. They all knew better than to challenge Tony directly. "We've got a problem," Tony began, spreading the papers across his desk like evidence at a trial. "Inventory's been coming up short. Money's missing from the register. And I've got a pretty good idea who's responsible." His eyes locked on Maria with theatrical precision. She felt her stomach drop, recognizing the setup even as it unfolded around her. "I've documented everything," Tony continued, holding up a folder thick with fabricated reports. "Missing supplies, cash discrepancies, customer complaints, all pointing to one person." Maria's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Mr. Castellano, I've never..." Save it. Tony's interruption was sharp, final. I've got witnesses, I've got documentation, and I've got security footage that shows you alone in the kitchen after hours. It was a lie, but Maria realized with growing horror that it didn't matter. Tony had been building this case for weeks, creating a paper trail that would justify her termination and deflect attention from his own crimes. The office door opened with a soft creak. Frank Sullivan stepped inside, but this wasn't the quiet retiree who'd occupied the corner booth for months. This man wore a crisp dress uniform, ribbons and medals creating a rainbow of service across his chest. His bearing was ramrod straight, his presence filling the small room with an authority that made Tony's bluster seem like a child's tantrum. "Gentlemen, lady." Frank's voice carried the weight of 3 decades of command. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Tony's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and growing alarm. "Who? What are you doing here?" "This is a private meeting." Frank placed a manila folder on the desk with deliberate precision. "Colonel Frank Sullivan, United States Army, retired, and this is my building." The silence that followed was absolute. Maria felt her world tilt on its axis, everything she thought she knew rearranging itself around this impossible revelation. "I've been conducting my own investigation," Frank continued, his tone conversational but edged with steel. "Into theft of veteran hiring tax credits, falsification of employment records, and systematic harassment of a decorated combat veteran." He opened his folder, revealing photographs, bank statements, and official VA documentation. "Mr. Castellano, you've been claiming tax credits for veterans who don't exist, pocketing approximately $15,000 over the past 6 months. You've also been submitting false incident reports about Sergeant Rodriguez here, creating a paper trail to justify her termination when she became a threat to your operation." Tony's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "You can't prove any of this. It's her word against mine." "Actually," Frank said, producing a small recording device, "it's your word against your own. Amazing what people will confess when they think nobody important is listening." The recording played Tony's voice, clear and damning. "Another $5,000 this quarter, easy money. And when the audit comes, that little waitress takes the fall." Maria's knees nearly buckled. Months of gaslighting, of being told she was incompetent, unreliable, damaged goods. All of it crumbled in the face of this evidence. Frank turned to her, his expression softening. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I've reviewed your service record. 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star with V device for valor, Army Commendation Medal for your work at the field hospital in Kandahar. You saved 37 lives in a single mortar attack." Tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. "Sir, I don't understand." "Why?" "Because I didn't survive 3 wars to watch a hero get destroyed by a coward." Frank's voice carried the weight of personal loss, of battles fought and brothers lost. "And because my son David served in your unit, he wrote about you in his letters home. Said you were the reason half his squad made it back alive." The connection hit Maria like a physical blow. David Sullivan. The young private who'd joked about his father's overprotective nature, who'd carried pictures of home in his helmet, who died in her arms when the convoy hit an IED outside the forward operating base. "David was," she whispered, "my boy, my only child." Frank's voice remained steady, but Maria could see the grief that lived behind his eyes. He wrote that if anything happened to him, I should look after his medic. Said you were the strongest person he'd ever known, but that you carried everyone else's pain and forgot to take care of yourself. The office door burst open as two figures in uniform entered, a VA investigator and a local police officer. Frank had spent days coordinating this moment with military precision, ensuring that Tony's crimes would face both civilian and federal consequences. Tony Castellano, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and assault. The handcuffs clicked with a finality that echoed through the small room. As Tony was led away, his protests fading into the morning bustle, Frank turned back to Maria. Sergeant Rodriguez, I have a proposition for you. She wiped her eyes with the back of her good hand, trying to process the rapid shift in her reality. This restaurant needs new management, someone who understands what it means to serve others, someone who can turn it into what it should be, a place where veterans feel welcome, where service members know they have allies. Frank's smile was gentle but determined. The position comes with full health benefits, tuition assistance for nursing school, and a salary that will let you provide for Sophia without working yourself into the ground. Maria felt the familiar urge to refuse, to insist she didn't need charity. But Frank seemed to read her thoughts. This isn't charity, Sergeant. This is what we do for family. This is how we honor the fallen and take care of the living. Jenny stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Maria, we all knew something was wrong. We should have spoken up sooner. We should have protected you. You did what you could to survive, Maria replied, her voice stronger now. No judgment. We all fight our battles differently. The real mission was just beginning. As Maria stood in that cramped office, surrounded by the debris of Tony's schemes and the promise of Frank's offer, she felt something shift inside her chest. The weight she'd been carrying, the shame, the isolation, the constant fear, began to lift. For the first time in months, she straightened her shoulders with the same military bearing that had carried her through 2 combat deployments. Not as the broken woman Tony had tried to create, but as the soldier she'd always been. Sir, she said, and Frank heard the change in her voice immediately. I accept your offer, but I have some conditions of my own. Frank raised an eyebrow, intrigued. If we're going to do this, we do it right. This place becomes more than just a restaurant. It becomes a hub for veterans who are struggling, who need community, who've forgotten what it feels like to be valued. Maria's words came faster now, fueled by a vision that had been growing in the back of her mind for weeks. We hire veterans whenever possible. We partner with the VA for job training programs. We create a space where service doesn't end with discharge. Frank's smile broadened. Sergeant, I think my son would have been very proud of you. Outside, the morning rush continued, customers unaware that they'd witnessed the birth of something that would change lives. In 6 months, the Mountain View Diner would transform into Veterans Corner, a gathering place where Purple Heart recipients served coffee alongside recent graduates from basic training, where the walls displayed not just military memorabilia, but stories of service, sacrifice, and second chances. But that transformation began in a cramped office with a handshake between 2 soldiers who understood that the most important battles aren't always fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they're fought in diners and offices and courtrooms where the weapons are truth and courage, and the victory is measured not in territory gained, but in lives restored. Maria's first instinct was to refuse. The soldier in her had been trained to be self-reliant, to carry her own weight, to never accept what felt like pity. But as she looked into Frank's eyes that held the same loss she carried, the same understanding of what it meant to serve, she realized this wasn't about charity. This was about something David had written in his last letter home, something she'd never known. "Tell Dad that Sergeant Rodriguez saved my life 3 times before the IED got me. And if anything happens to me, make sure someone's looking out for her. She's the kind of person who'll die taking care of everyone else before she asks for help." I need to think about it," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded. "Take all the time you need, Sergeant. But while you're thinking, know this. You've already earned everything I'm offering. This isn't about what happened to you. It's about who you are." The next few days passed in a surreal haze. Tony's arrest made the local news, and suddenly Maria found herself at the center of a story she'd never wanted to tell. Reporters called, wanting interviews about workplace harassment and veteran struggles. The VA reached out about her delayed benefits. Sophia's teacher mentioned that her daughter had been writing essays about invisible heroes and asking why some grown-ups were mean to soldiers. But it was the other changes that surprised Maria most. Veterans she'd never met began stopping by the diner, ordering coffee, and leaving generous tips with quiet nods of recognition. Jenny and the other staff treated her with a new respect that felt both wonderful and uncomfortable. Pete, the morning cook, started sharing stories about his own son's deployment to Iraq. "You know," he said one afternoon as they prepped for the lunch rush, "I always wondered why you kept that soldier's pride even when that bastard was tearing you down. Now I understand. Some things can't be broken, no matter how hard someone tries." Frank returned on Thursday, back in his civilian clothes but carrying the same quiet authority. He found Maria during her break, sitting in the parking lot and staring at the mountains that rose like ancient guardians beyond the city. "Beautiful view," he said, settling onto the picnic bench beside her. "David used to say that mountains were like promises," Maria replied. "Always there, always solid, even when everything else was falling apart." Frank's breath caught. He wrote that in a letter once, about the mountains in Afghanistan. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 soldiers sharing the weight of memory. Finally, Maria spoke. "I've been thinking about your offer, about what it would mean." She turned to face him, and Frank saw something new in her expression. Not just the exhaustion and pain he'd observed for weeks, but a spark of the leader she'd been in combat. "If I do this, I want to do it right. Not just manage a restaurant, but create something that matters. Tell me what you're thinking." Maria's words came slowly at first, then with growing confidence. "Veterans Corner, that's what we call it. Not just a diner, but a community hub. We hire veterans whenever possible, partner with job training programs, host support groups. The walls tell our stories, not just the glory, but the struggle, the coming home, the rebuilding." Frank listened as she outlined her vision. Breakfast meetings for job-seeking veterans, a bulletin board for housing and employment opportunities, monthly gatherings where families could share the challenges of reintegration. She spoke about Sophia's questions, about how children of veterans needed to understand their parents' service, about creating a space where military families felt understood. "There's something else," Maria continued. "Tony wasn't the only one stealing from veteran programs. I've been researching, and there are businesses all over the state claiming credits for veterans they never hired. We could work with the VA to identify these cases, help real veterans find real jobs." Frank felt a familiar pride, the same feeling he'd experienced watching young soldiers grow into leaders. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I think you've found your mission." "There's one condition," Maria said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "We do this as partners, not owner and employee, but two veterans working toward the same goal. I won't be anyone's charity case, but I'll be your ally." Frank extended his hand. "Partners, then, in honor of David and every soldier who didn't make it home." Over the following weeks, Maria and Frank planned Veterans Corner. Sophia helped by drawing pictures of soldiers and families for the walls. "You smile more now, Mama," Sophia observed one evening. "Are you happy?" "I'm hopeful, Mija, and sometimes that's even better than happy." Veterans Corner opened on a November morning, 2 weeks before Veterans Day. The parking lot filled with cars bearing Purple Heart plates. Maria wore her dress uniform for the first time since discharge. The first customer through the door was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose husband had served in Vietnam. She'd been a regular during the Tony era, one of the few who'd tried to speak up for Maria. "I'm so proud of you, dear," she said, tears in her eyes. "This is exactly what this town needed." Throughout the morning, veterans and their families filled every table. Maria moved between them as a host welcoming family home, listening to stories and making connections. A young Marine with Pete's nephew's construction company, an Army widow with another Gold Star wife. Frank watched from behind the counter, manning the register and marveling at what Maria had created. This was more than a restaurant. It was a command post for healing, a place where service continued in new forms. "Colonel Sullivan?" A young voice interrupted his thoughts. Frank looked down to see Sophia, dressed in her best outfit and holding a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something for you," she said shyly. "For your son." Frank knelt to her level as she unfolded a handwritten letter. "Dear David, you don't know me, but my mama knew you. She says you were brave and kind, and that you made her promise to take care of other soldiers. I want you to know that she kept her promise. She takes care of everybody now, and your daddy helps her. I think you would be proud of them both. Thank you for watching over us. Love, Sofia Rodriguez." Frank's vision blurred as he read the child's careful handwriting. When he looked up, Maria was standing beside them, her own eyes bright with tears. "She wanted to thank him for sending you to help us." Maria's voice caught on the words. Frank folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. "I'll make sure he gets it," he promised Sophia. As the day wound down and the last customers lingered over coffee and conversation, Maria found herself standing in the same spot where Tony had destroyed her nursing school acceptance letter months before. But everything had changed. The walls now displayed photographs and stories from local veterans. A bulletin board near the entrance advertised job opportunities and housing assistance. The corner booth where Frank had observed her struggles now held a small plaque. "Reserved for those who serve." Jenny approached with the day's receipts, her face glowing with excitement. "Maria, we served over 200 people today. And look at this." She held up a jar labeled Emergency Fund for Veterans in Need that was already half full with donations. "It's not about the money," Maria replied, but she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that they'd created something sustainable, something that could truly help people. Frank joined them, his own expression reflecting the same quiet pride. "Sergeant, I think we've accomplished our mission." "No, sir," Maria corrected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd found her purpose again. "We've just begun." Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against the evening sky, eternal and unchanging. But inside Veterans Corner, something new had taken root. A community built on service, sacrifice, and the understanding that coming home from war was just the beginning of a different kind of battle. Maria Rodriguez had found her way back to being a soldier, not despite her struggles, but because of them. And in doing so, she'd created a place where other veterans could find their way home too. The mission would continue. One cup of coffee, one conversation, one act of service at a time. Heroes don't always wear uniforms, Maria had learned. Sometimes they wear aprons and serve coffee with courage, creating sanctuaries where the wounded can heal and the lost can find their way back to themselves. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they discover that the strongest thing they can do isn't to carry the weight alone, but to share it with others who understand the burden of service, the cost of freedom, and the endless responsibility of caring for those who've given everything for their country. 6 months later, Maria stood behind the counter of Veterans Corner, watching the morning rush with eyes that had learned to see possibility instead of problems. The familiar sounds of coffee brewing and conversations flowing created a symphony she'd grown to love. Not the chaotic noise of survival, but the harmonious buzz of community. Sophia sat at table 12, Frank's old observation post, working on her homework before school. She'd become the unofficial mascot of Veterans Corner, greeting regular customers by name and helping elderly veterans navigate the steps to the front door. Her latest school project, a report titled "My Mom, the Invisible Hero," lay spread across the table beside her math worksheets. "Mama," Sophia called out, "Mrs. Chen wants to know if you have time to look at her son's resume today." Maria nodded to the Vietnamese woman whose son had recently returned from deployment in Syria. Mrs. Chen had become a regular, not just for the coffee, but for the network of support that had grown around Veterans Corner like roots spreading through fertile soil. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. There were days when the weight of everyone's stories felt overwhelming, when Maria found herself absorbing the pain of too many struggling veterans. She'd learned to recognize the signs in herself, the familiar tightness in her chest, the way her injured hand would ache when stress levels rose. But she'd also learned something David had tried to teach her in his letters, that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey shared with others walking the same path. Throughout the morning, new faces appeared, veterans who'd heard about Veterans Corner through word of mouth, drawn by the promise of understanding and community. Maria greeted each one, recognizing the familiar signs of those still finding their way home. That evening, after the last customer had left and the staff had gone home, Maria and Frank sat in the empty dining room, sharing a quiet beer and processing the day's events. Maria's eyes moved across the walls covered with photographs and stories of local veterans. "Sometimes I wonder if we can really make this last." Frank considered her words. "You know what I learned in 3 wars? The mission doesn't change just because the terrain gets difficult." "David would have loved this place," Maria said quietly. "He did love it," Frank replied. "Every letter he wrote mentioned how you created family wherever you went, how you made the aid station feel like home, even in the middle of a war zone." I never knew he wrote about that. Frank pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket pocket. This was his last letter. "Want to hear what he said about you?" Maria nodded, not trusting her voice. Frank's voice was steady as he read, "Dad, I know you worry about what happens to us after we come home. But I'm not worried about Sergeant Rodriguez. She's got this way of turning any place into somewhere people belong. She'll be fine, and she'll make sure everyone around her is fine too. That's just who she is." Tears rolled down Maria's cheeks as she absorbed her young soldier's final words about her. He saw something I couldn't see in myself. He saw what I see now, Frank said. A leader who creates community wherever she goes. A soldier who never stopped serving. They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, dozens of veterans who needed support, the daily work of building something that mattered more than profit. Tonight, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced since before her deployment. The deep satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Sophia's essay lay on the counter where she'd left it. The title page decorated with drawings of soldiers and families, and a building that looked remarkably like Veterans Corner. The final paragraph read, "My mom is a hero not because she won medals in the army, but because she never stopped being a soldier. She taught me that heroes don't always save people from bad guys with guns. Sometimes they save people from being alone, from giving up, from forgetting that they matter. Veterans Corner isn't just where my mom works. It's where heroes come to remember who they are." Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, eternal guardians watching over a community that had learned the most important lesson of military service. That coming home isn't about finding a place on a map, but about creating a place where others can find their way back to themselves. Maria Rodriguez had discovered that the strongest thing she could do wasn't to fight alone, but to build something bigger than herself. A sanctuary where invisible heroes could become visible again, where service continued in new forms, and where the promise made to every soldier could finally be kept, that no one would be left behind. The mission would continue, one veteran at a time. Maria's story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, in coffee shops, offices, and communities across America. Sometimes the person serving your morning coffee carries more courage than you'll ever know. Who's the invisible hero in your life? Share their story in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because every veteran deserves to know they're not forgotten. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light.